On the afternoon of the 8th of September 2022, a man in Scotland became the owner of roughly 130,000 acres of England and Wales. He did not sign anything. There was no will, no probate, no solicitor, no exchange of contracts. There was no meeting. Nobody handed him a set of keys, and nobody offered congratulations, because on that particular afternoon, the thing that had happened to his grandmother left no room for congratulating anyone about anything. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, he was not the Duke of Cornwall. By the evening, he was. And the mechanism that moved a billion-pound estate from one man to another in that gap was a charter written in the year 1337. Not a modern statute. Not a trust drafted by clever lawyers in the 20th century. A document created by Edward III in the 10th year of his reign, when the 100 Years' War had not yet begun and the Black Death was 11 years away. That charter is still working. It worked that afternoon. It will work again on some future afternoon that none of us can predict, and it will move the same land to somebody who has not been born yet. I am Richard, and this is Richard Valentin. Today we are going to look at what Prince William actually inherited, which is far stranger than most people realize, and at what he has done with it since, which is genuinely unusual and has not been reported particularly well. Because here is the thing that makes this story worth 40 minutes of your evening. In November of 2024, a piece of investigative journalism landed on that estate, and it was not flattering. Not at all. And what happened next was not a denial, and it was not silence. It was a series of changes announced over the following 18 months that go a great deal further than anyone expected. Whether those changes are enough is a question I am going to put to you rather than answer for you. But the pattern is real, and it is documented, and the documents are all published. Do subscribe before we begin, and stay to the end, because there is one part of this inheritance that almost nobody knows about, and it involves people who died alone. Let me take you back, because you cannot understand any of this without the beginning. In 1337, Edward III had a problem that every medieval king had. He had an eldest son. That son was 6 years old, and he was going to grow up. And when he grew up, he was going to need money. Now, an heir without an income is a dangerous thing. History is full of them. A grown prince with expensive tastes and no revenue of his own is a prince who borrows from barons, and a prince who owes money to barons is a prince who can be leaned on. Edward had watched what happened to his own father, and he had no intention of repeating it. So he did something clever. He did not give his son an allowance, because an allowance can be argued about every year, and it makes the recipient a supplicant. He gave him land. He carved out a block of estates, largely in the southwest, and created a dukedom around them, the Duchy of Cornwall. The first duke was that 6-year-old boy who grew up to be Edward of Woodstock and whom we remember as the Black Prince. And here is the part that has echoed down 688 years. Edward did not give the duchy to his son personally, to keep and pass on as he wished. He attached it to a position. The duchy belongs to the eldest surviving son of the monarch, provided that son is the heir apparent, not to the eldest child, not to the heir generally. To the eldest surviving son who is heir apparent, which is why Princess Anne has never held it and never could have, and why the Princess Royal's position in all of this is a matter people still write letters about. It moves automatically. The moment a monarch dies and the heir becomes king, the heir's own eldest son becomes Duke of Cornwall. There is no interval. There is no decision. There is no document to sign. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it is genuinely remarkable, and we walk past it. You and I, if we inherit anything at all, will wait months. There will be probate. There will be forms and valuations and a solicitor's letter that arrives 11 weeks after you expected it. There may be inheritance tax at 40% above the threshold, and the family may fall out, and it may take a year. And a charter written in 1337 moves £1 billion of land between two living men in the time it takes for a heart to stop. That is not a criticism. It is simply a fact about the difference between the arrangements the rest of us live under and the arrangements that were made in the 14th century and never unmade. Part TWO, HOAS at S, AC2OLE IT. So what did William receive that afternoon? Around 130,000 acres spread across more than 20 counties in England and Wales. Not concentrated in Cornwall, despite the name. farmland, moorland, coastline, woodland, residential property, commercial property. Some of the individual items will surprise you. The Oval Cricket Ground in Kennington sits on Duchy land. If you have ever watched a test match at the Oval, you have watched it on the Duchy of Cornwall, the Isles of Scilly, almost in their entirety. Large parts of Dartmoor, including the site of Dartmoor Prison at Princetown, which is leased to the Ministry of Justice. Hold on to that one, because it becomes the emotional center of this story later on. And 2 new towns. Poundbury in Dorset, which was Charles's project and which people have argued about for 30 years, and Nansleton in Cornwall, which is newer and larger and which is now Williams. The estate is valued at over £1 billion, and the income it produces, the distributable surplus, has run at around £23 million a year. £23.6 million in the 2023 to 2024 financial year, £22.9 million the year after. That money is not a salary, and it is not the sovereign grant. The sovereign grant is public money, and it pays for the king's official duties. The duchy is a private estate, and its surplus pays for the Prince and Princess of Wales, their 3 children, their household, their official work, and their charitable activity. There is one wrinkle in the ownership that matters and that almost nobody explains properly. Under the Crown Lands Act, 1702, the Duke receives the income from the duchy, not the capital. He cannot sell the estate and pocket the proceeds. He is, in the language these arrangements always use, a custodian rather than an owner in the ordinary sense. Which sounds like a technicality until you realize it is the whole reason any of what follows was possible. Part 3. November 2024. Now we come to the difficult part, and I am going to give it to you straight because the alternative is to be useless to you. In November 2024, Channel 4's dispatches and the Sunday Times published a joint investigation into the 2 royal duchies, the Duchy of Cornwall, Williams, and the Duchy of Lancaster, which belongs to the king. The finding was this. Over the preceding period, deals made by the 2 duchies had raised something in the order of £50 million, and a great deal of it had come from public bodies and from charities. Let me give you the specific examples that were reported, because the specifics are what made it land. A lease between the Duchy of Cornwall and the Ministry of Justice for Dartmoor Prison reported at £37.5 million. A deal between Guy's and St. Thomas NHS Trust and the Duchy of Lancaster reported at £11.4 million over 15 years to rent a warehouse in London to store ambulances, and 6 leases with local state schools, which the investigation calculated would earn the Duchy of Cornwall around £600,000 over their lifetimes. Now, I want to be scrupulous here, because there is a version of this that is unfair, and I do not want to give it to you. Every one of those arrangements was a commercial transaction between 2 parties. The Ministry of Justice needed a prison site. The NHS Trust needed somewhere to park ambulances. The schools needed premises. Somebody owned the land. Rent was agreed. That is how property works. And if the duchy had not owned that land, somebody else would have, and the public body would have paid rent to them instead. That is a real answer, and it deserves to be stated. But here is why it did not settle the matter. And here is what I think people were actually reacting to. There is something that sits uncomfortably in the arrangement, even when every individual transaction is defensible. Money raised from taxation, passing to the private income of the heir to the throne, through leases that most of the public had no idea existed. An ambulance service paying rent that ends up in a private estate. A school doing the same. Nobody had broken any rule. That was rather the point. The rules permitted it. And the rules were very old, and nobody had looked at them in a long time. The duchy's response at the time was that it is a private estate with a commercial imperative, pursued alongside a commitment to the environment and to social impact in its communities, which is accurate as a description, and did not do very much to answer the question people were actually asking. Part 4, what happened next? Here is where the story turns, and here is why I wanted to make this film. Because what usually happens after an investigation like that is nothing. A statement is issued. A news cycle passes. 18 months later, somebody writes a follow-up piece noting that no changes were made, and the follow-up gets a fraction of the attention the original did, and that is the end of it. That is not what happened. At the start of 2025, the Duchy appointed a new Secretary and Keeper of Records, Will Bax. That title, Secretary and Keeper of Records, is itself a piece of the 14th century that survived. And in June 2025, when the annual accounts were published, he described the Duchy as entering what he called an era of deep change. Now, executives say things like that constantly, and it usually means nothing at all. So let us look at what was actually announced rather than how it was described. A policy review of the rents received from charities and from grassroots community groups. Grassroots organizations that are direct tenants of the Duchy would have their rents waived entirely. The example given was an orchard used for therapeutic gardening. Local charities that are Duchy tenants would receive a reduction of up to 50%. Take that seriously for a moment. That is an estate voluntarily reducing its own income in response to public criticism in a way that has a direct cost and no obvious commercial benefit. You can be as cynical as you like about the motive, and cynicism is often warranted in these stories, but the money still goes out of the door. And then, in June of this year, the Duchy published its 2026 Integrated Impact Report, and the scale of it moved again. The headline is a new strategy involving £500 million of investment over the next decade, directed into 5 geographic areas the Duchy is calling heartlands. Some of what is in the report is the sort of thing every large landowner now says: nature recovery, peatland restoration, net zero. Tregooden Farm in Cornwall has become the Duchy's first focus farm to reach net zero emissions. There is a 20-year vision for the Dartmoor landscape and work on expanding Atlantic rainforest, which is a genuinely rare habitat, and I would happily do a whole film on it. Some of it is housing, and this is where it starts to matter to ordinary people. More than 1,000 homes at Poundbury and Nansleton welcomed buyers and renters over the year. In southeast Faversham, in Kent, the Duchy has secured a planning resolution for a new community of 2,500 homes, of which around 900 are to be affordable. And in Nansleton, the report records the first homes created to directly address homelessness. That last one deserves a sentence of context. William launched a program called Homewards in 2023, aimed at ending homelessness, and a great many people said at the time that it was the usual thing: a royal patronage, a launch event, some warm words, and nothing you could point at 3 years later. 3 years later, there are houses. Not many. But they exist, they are on Duchy land, and they are in the audited report. But the announcement I want to spend real time on is the one about Dartmoor, because it is the one that tells you something about how this estate is now thinking, and because it is a story about a kind of place that a lot of you will recognize. Princetown sits high on Dartmoor. It is one of the highest settlements in England, and one of the wettest, and it exists for one reason: the prison. Dartmoor Prison was built in 1809 to hold prisoners of war. The town grew up around it. Everything in Princetown, the shops, the pubs, the school, the housing, the population itself, existed because there was a prison there, and the prison needed staff, and the staff needed to live somewhere and buy things. And the prison is closing. If you have lived in a town like that, you know exactly what happens next, and you do not need me to describe it. Some of you watching grew up in a pit village. Some of you grew up where the mill was, or the works, or the yard. You know the sequence. First, the jobs, then the young people, then the shops, one at a time, and the ones that stay put up a handwritten sign about reduced hours. Then the bus route gets cut because there is nobody on it. Then the school. It takes about 15 years, and it is nobody's fault in particular, which is what makes it so hard to fight. The Ministry of Justice pays the Duchy £1.5 million a year to lease that prison site. And in June, William announced that the entire £1.5 million a year is being redirected into Princetown and the surrounding area through a community-led regeneration fund managed in partnership with the community itself, not a donation. The whole rent redirected into the place the closure is going to hurt. I have read a good deal of corporate social responsibility material over the years, and most of it is a rounding error dressed up in a photograph. This is not that. This is the entire income stream from the asset, given to the community that surrounds the asset for as long as the arrangement lasts. And I keep thinking about the shape of it. because the money is not coming from the duchy's charitable arm or from a fund set up for the purpose. It is coming out of the surplus, which is to say it is coming out of the £23 million a year that pays for a family. You can find that impressive or you can find it insufficient, and both are respectable positions. But it is not nothing, and I do not think it has been reported anywhere near as widely as the investigation that preceded it was. That asymmetry is worth naming, actually. The criticism was on the front pages. The response was in the trade press and a handful of royal correspondence columns. That is how it almost always goes, and it is one of the reasons people end up with a picture of the world that is 18 months out of date. Now, I promised you something at the beginning, and here it is. And it is the strangest thing in this entire film. If you die in Cornwall without a will and without any relative who qualifies to inherit under the intestacy rules, your estate does not go to the Treasury. It goes to the Duke of Cornwall. This is real. It is not a quirk of custom. It is Section 46 of the Administration of Estates Act 1925, and the doctrine is called bona vacantia, which is Latin for ownerless goods. For almost the whole of England and Wales, when somebody dies alone with no will and no traceable family, the estate passes to the Crown and is administered by the government legal department, and the proceeds go to the Treasury. Public money for public purposes. But there are two exceptions carved out of that, both of them medieval. The historic County Palatine of Lancaster, covering much of Lancashire, Merseyside, Greater Manchester, and parts of Cumbria, where such estates go to the Duke of Lancaster, who is the king, and the County of Cornwall, where they go to the Duke of Cornwall, who is William. The power dates back to a grant made by Edward III to John of Gaunt in 1377. It has been sitting in English law for 649 years now. I want to handle this carefully, because it is very easy to describe in a way that is technically accurate and completely misleading, and the misleading version has done the rounds. The Duchy of Cornwall's position, and the BBC has reported it, is that funds received this way go to the Duke of Cornwall's Benevolent Fund, which supports local community projects and charities. They do not go into the private income. The Duchy of Lancaster says the same about its own arrangement and directs its bona vacantia funds to 3 charities and to environmental improvement on the estate. The Guardian challenged aspects of how that money was spent, arguing that some of it effectively subsidized the estate's commercial operations, and the Duchy of Lancaster rejected that. So I am not going to tell you that anybody is pocketing the estates of the lonely dead, because on the published evidence that is not what is happening. What I will say is this, and I think it is the honest observation. There is something about the arrangement itself that gives me pause, entirely separately from where the money ends up. That when a person dies in Truro with no will and no family, the machinery that decides what happens to everything they owned is a 14th century grant, and the beneficiary in the first instance is a private estate belonging to the heir to the throne, and it takes a Freedom of Information request or an investigative journalist for anybody to find out how much money we are talking about. The Law Commission has looked at this area. It did not take the point up. And I mention it here in a film about William for one reason. If you inherit an estate built in 1337, you inherit all of it. The land, the rents, the towns, the coastline. And also this, the parts nobody designed and nobody defends and nobody has quite got round to changing. There is one more thing, and I would be letting you down if I skipped it, just because the rest of this film has been reasonably warm. The Duchy of Cornwall does not pay corporation tax. It is not a company in the ordinary sense, and it falls outside that regime. Since 1993, there has been a voluntary arrangement under which the Duke pays income tax on the surplus after the deduction of official expenditure. In 2024, William was asked how much tax he had paid on the previous year's surplus, and he declined to say. Now, since then, something has shifted around him. This year, for the first time in history, the royal household published the king's personal tax payment. £11.7 million in 2023 to 2024, and £12.9 million in 2024 to 2025. The father has published. The son, as far as I have been able to establish, has not. I am not going to make more of that than it deserves. There may be perfectly ordinary reasons, and the voluntary arrangement is honored, and nobody suggests otherwise. But if you are going to run an estate on a platform of deep change and social impact and transparency about your environmental performance down to the emissions of an individual farm, then the number people actually want is the tax number. And a precedent for publishing it has just been set in the same family, in the same summer. I suspect that question is going to be asked again, and I do not think it goes away. Let me put the other side properly, because there is a strong one. He did not choose any of it. William did not select this inheritance, did not design its arrangements, did not write the 1337 Charter or the 1925 Act or the 1702 Act. He was handed a 14th century institution on the worst afternoon of his adult life and told it was now his responsibility. He cannot sell it. Under the 1702 Act, he takes income, not capital. So the option that any ordinary owner would have to dispose of the awkward parts and simplify is not available to him, and he has moved. Whatever you think of the pace, he has moved. Rents waived for grassroots tenants. Charity rents halved. £500 million of investment committed over a decade. The whole Dartmoor prison rent redirected to Princetown. 900 affordable homes in a single Kent development. The first homes for people who were homeless. Set that against the standard behavior of large landed estates in this country when they come under criticism, which is to say nothing, change nothing, and wait. And it is a striking record. The counter-argument is equally clear, and I will not soften it. £23 million a year continues to flow to one family from an estate that pays no corporation tax and receives rent from schools, hospitals, and prisons. The reforms are voluntary. They were announced by the beneficiary, they can be reversed by the beneficiary, and there is no external body with the power to require any of it. Both of those are true. I hold both of them at once, and I am not going to pretend to resolve them for you. I keep coming back to that afternoon in September 2022. A man loses his grandmother. His father becomes king in the same instant. And in that same instant, without a signature, without a word spoken, 130,000 acres change hands because of something a medieval king decided about his 6-year-old son. There is a particular kind of weight in that which I do not think most of us can properly imagine, not the wealth. The inheritance of a set of decisions made by people who died 6 centuries ago, which you did not make, cannot escape, and are now expected to answer for. And the interesting thing about William, to me, is not that he inherited it. Anyone would have. It is that he appears to have read it. Because you can hold an estate like that for a lifetime without ever really looking at it. The machinery runs. The rents come in. The surplus arrives. Somebody else handles the leases, and you turn up for the photographs, and in 50 years you hand the whole thing on exactly as you found it, and nobody says a word against you. Reading it is the harder choice. Because once you have read it, you have to decide what to do about the school paying rent, and the prison town losing its prison, and the 14th century clause about the people who die alone. He has answered some of those. He has not answered all of them. So here's what I would like to know from you, and I mean it as a genuine question. Is voluntary reform enough? When the person deciding to give up income is the same person receiving it and can stop whenever he chooses and answers to nobody who could compel him? Or is that simply how it has always worked with these institutions, and the sensible thing is to take the improvement when it comes and keep asking for more? I go back and forth on it, and I would rather read your answer than give you mine. Everything in this film comes from published material. The Duchy of Cornwall's Integrated Impact Report for 2026 and its annual reports for 2024 and 2025, all free on the Duchy's own website. The Channel 4 dispatches and Sunday Times investigation of November 2024. BBC reporting on Bona Vacantia. The Administration of Estates Act 1925 and the Crown Lands Act 1702, both on legislation.gov.uk. Links below, and please check me on any of it. I am Richard. Thank you for staying with me to the end. There will be another next week, and I will see you then.